Welcome everybody, and thank you very much for coming to this really rather early first seminar for humans, AI, and decision making. And thank you especially, of course, to my presenters here, who are our presenters who are going to give us some really interesting information during this panel. Three of whom you can see before you, one of whom will be dialing in over GoToMeeting with any luck a little bit later in the proceedings. Now, by way of an introduction, I thought that the best thing for me to do was to kind of give you a sense of what we're going to be talking about during the seminar. So after my poorly structured and rambling initial remarks, Isabel Thompson from Holtzbrinck Publishing Group will give us a presentation around defining an artificial intelligence strategy. Isabel has some absolute fantastic experience working at Holtzbrinck, and then before that at Cambridge University Press, and she is going to be, and so just again kind of give you a little bit of a spoiler about what she's going to talk about. When she talks about an artificial intelligence strategy, or when she asks that question, she's going to explain how that really is the wrong question to ask. So that's a good starting point for a seminar on artificial intelligence. After that, John Sack, here from Highwire Press, who's founding director at Highwire Press, he's going to give us something that's a little bit more practical, in a sense, because he's going to be talking about the editorial questions that artificial intelligence can answer. After John's talk, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion where everybody can kind of ask questions and talk a little bit about what we've heard so far, and then there'll be a networking break before John Stroll of Clarivate Analytics is going to give a talk about essentially the technology that sort of underlies artificial intelligence. So that'll give us some more kind of context and some more kind of basic understanding of what we're talking about. And then dialing in over GoToMeeting will be Pauline Crepel of My Science Work. And the stuff that she's going to be talking about is a little bit more on the bleeding edge, perhaps, and it's a little bit more around perhaps reputational management and how artificial intelligence works for researchers. So that'll be an interesting kind of rounded off for the whole seminar. And after that, we'll have another short discussion. So I neglected to mention that I'm Phil Jones, and I'm from Emerald Publishing. If that affiliation is somewhat confusing, I used to work at Digital Science until really quite recently. So that gives me an interesting perspective in a sense, because I'm somewhat of a poacher turned gamekeeper in that I used to be interested in developing these kinds of technologies as products, and now I'm on the other end as a publisher thinking about whether they are relevant and interesting for the sorts of things that we're trying to achieve ourselves. So my very simple introduction into how we got here. In a sense, this is the rationale that kind of kicks off where this seminar sort of comes from. So in terms of information and decision making, I suppose the grandfather of all of this is Eugene Garfield, who founded ISI back in 1955. And as everybody knows, so I won't go into too much detail about what Web of Science is and about what those kinds of analytics, those kind of scientometric analytics are, I'd suffice to say that what Eugene Garfield really wanted to do was to measure the propagation, if you like, of human knowledge. So the idea is that an individual, a researcher, writes an article, that article might get cited by 2 or 3 more articles, which get cited again and get cited again and so forth, and he wanted to create a network of that propagation of knowledge. And that's a very interesting and fascinating way of looking at how we learn as people, as humans, and how we move forward in terms of understanding the world around us. What it was used for, a fair amount, particularly the impact factor, is comparing the reputations and the prestige and the quality of journals themselves. So that's a good use of using this sort of data in order to make decisions. And librarians today still use the impact factor when they're judging which journals to subscribe to and which to not subscribe to. Where it was misused, and where it continues to be arguably misused, is in the measurement of the quality of the components that go into the journal. If you like, measuring the quality of researchers or measuring the quality of the content within the journal itself. And anybody who kind of follows kind of scientometrics and the responsible use of analytics will be aware of cases, particularly internationally, where academics are incentivized to publish in high-impact journals, where they are judged based on the impact factor of the journals that they publish in rather than the quality of the research itself. So that's an early example of how when we have a particular metric, it's possible to misuse it. And I think that's a very important point that we will probably expand on a little bit later. So the thing about the impact factor is, well, the impact factor really, and ISI in general, is that it was a valuable resource and continues to be a valuable resource, but something changed when the internet came along. Now this graph here is from the Leiden Manifesto, and what it shows is the number of mentions of impact factor in the academic literature, and along came the internet and you see it kind of rocketed. So in a sense that was showing you that there was an appetite, as informatics came along, to use metrics and to use analytics in order to assess things and to make decisions. The problem seemed to be that we only had this one metric that anybody was using, and we were applying it to too many things. So when all you have is a hammer, everything kind of looks like a nail. The response to that from the kind of community and the industry was to broaden the sorts of things that we are measuring. And many of you will be familiar with the Altmetric Manifesto. Jason Preem was the lead author in that, and if you were involved in those kinds of conversations a few years ago, he would have been in very many panels talking about his view of how we expand, how we judge the scholarly literature and scholarly content and make decisions around that. And there were a couple of commercial vendors that appeared. Altmetric is one very notable example. Plum Analytics is another, who are gathering things like mainstream media mentions, policy documents, news articles, so on and so forth, to get a bigger understanding of the impact of that literature. But at the end of the day, that's still just counting stuff. And so it's not really getting to the underlying quality, if you like, or qualities of the research being done in a way that's going to enable people to make intelligent decisions, or that's going to give us all of the information necessary to make the best decisions. So we start to see, in a sense, signals of disquiet around this issue. That it's not just good enough to count, we have to start building stories, if you like, around content, around articles, around research and around researchers. So from the community we see things like the Metric Tide and the Leiden Manifesto, which I previously mentioned, and then DORA in San Francisco, the Declaration on Research Assessment. And so there's this sense that we can't just use metrics as a blanket way of assessing things, you have to use them in a responsible way. And you see funders, particularly in the UK, around the Research Excellence Framework, asking institutions to write narratives around the sorts of impact that their research is having so that they can make better decisions about how to spend their money. We see that in the Netherlands with the Dutch Standard Evaluation Protocol, and in Australia as well with the ERA. And I think there are several other kind of examples internationally of how funders are looking to really assess a broader sense of what impact is beyond simply counting, whether that be citations or alternative metrics. So that brings us to turning impact into narrative. And one of the things that occurred to me when I was putting this presentation together is that there are three really quite well developed products from three very interesting information services companies out there. From digital science, there's Symplectic Elements, which is sold to institutions to enable them to get a sense of all of the research that they are producing, all of the inputs in terms of grants, all of the outputs in terms of publications and so forth. Converis from Clarivate Analytics performs a very similar function, and Pure from Elsevier. So those are three examples of what we call a current research information system, which is allowing institutions to tell stories about the research that their academics are doing, which then funders use as a way to make decisions about where they're directing their funding. In addition to that, we see companies springing up who are tackling that from a researcher point of view and helping researchers tell stories about the impact of the work that they're doing, in hopes that will allow them to get better funding, allow them to get promoted, and allow them to build kudos, if you like, within the academic community and amongst institutions and ultimately funders. So we get to the point where we realize that it's necessary to look beyond numbers. And so if we're looking beyond numbers and telling stories about impact, can we turn this on its head and start teaching the computers to read, teaching the computers to understand those narratives, or to make those narratives for us so that we can scale this kind of analysis? And this brings us to some of the research that we're going to be talking about during the course of the seminar. And I think it's worth kind of giving you one kind of taster of one technique that's used around semantic analysis, or artificial intelligence, if you like, that helps us kind of start to move towards that situation where computers are making a more almost qualitative, or maybe they're quantizing something that we would previously look at as qualitative, kind of understanding assertions and concepts and so forth. So this is a very simple example, and it shows a very simple kind of concept extraction or topic model analysis. And what we do is we take a series of articles and we look at the frequency of the words that's used in those articles, and then we perhaps compare that to the frequency of words used in similar articles about a different subject, and what drops out are the important technical words. And then you start to see how you can extract concepts from a corpus of literature. And so once you can start to extract concepts from a corpus of literature, you can start to classify things in interesting ways, and then you can start measuring a number of different sorts of ideas and concepts, and build a much broader picture of what's going on. We'll probably talk a little bit later on about some of the newer research that's going on to take things beyond this kind of topic modeling level into things like semantic triples and assertion mapping, where we're trying to understand the relationships between objects mentioned in literature so that we can figure out not just what the ideas are that are being talked about, but hopefully eventually how those ideas relate to each other and the statements that are being made. So these sorts of tools are already appearing, and they've already been around for a little while. If you look at Elsevier's SciVal, that's capable of pulling concepts out of literature, and you can do analyses around emergent topics and ideas and word models that are within the content that SciVal can explore. And Digital Science, working with their consultancy and Dimensions, also do a lot of very, very good work around topic modeling and around concept extraction, which is then used to fuel their consultancies for publishing and for publishers and for funders and for institutions, helping them understand where growth areas are within particular disciplines, who emergent researchers are, those sorts of questions. So as well as those more mature companies, we also have some innovators entering the market, some insurgent players, if you like, and just two examples, because there are many. Unsilo, they're partnering with Springer Nature and Karga to create a product that, well, they do a number of things, but one of the products is kind of interfaces with that research, with that publisher's content, and allows you to pull out concepts, spin up microsites around particular issues and concepts and ideas. And then Meta. And during John's talk, he'll be talking a little bit about what Highwire are doing with Meta. And so those of you who've been interested in what's going to come out of that, and have been interested in what the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation are trying to do there, would be very interested to hear from John about that. So that is basically my whistle-stop tour of the rationale that leads us to this discussion.